My husband kissed me goodbye before his reunion, and 3 hours later my sister sent me a photograph that changed the way I saw the last 45 years of my life. I remember standing in the kitchen when the message came through, the late afternoon sun stretching across the hardwood floors we had refinished together decades ago. Thomas had left that morning in his pressed navy blazer, smelling faintly of the cologne he only wore on special occasions. He leaned down, brushed his lips against my cheek, and said, "Don't wait up, Maggie. It might be a long night." I smiled the way wives do after nearly half a century of marriage, with quiet trust and routine affection. At 68, I believed I understood the rhythms of my husband's life the way I understood the ticking of the grandfather clock in our hallway. Reliable. Predictable. Safe. When my phone buzzed, I assumed it was a grocery coupon or one of those pharmacy reminders about my blood pressure prescription. Instead, it was Evelyn. My older sister never sent messages without a reason. The image loaded slowly, pixel by pixel, until the shape of a hotel patio came into focus. String lights overhead. A banner that read, "Class of '72." And there he was. Thomas. My husband of 45 years. Standing a little too close to a woman I didn't recognize. His hand rested at the small of her back in a way that was not accidental, not polite, not friendly. Evelyn's text followed beneath the photo, "I'm sorry, Maggie. I thought you should see this." I didn't drop the phone. I didn't gasp. I set the kettle back onto its base and watched the steam curl upward. For months, something in our home had felt slightly misaligned, like a picture frame hung just a fraction of an inch off center. Thomas had become protective of his phone, stepping outside to take calls, laughing softly at messages he never shared. He started going to the gym again, bought 2 new dress shirts, and insisted he needed space to reconnect with old friends, at this reunion in Denver, nearly 1,200 miles from our home in Ohio. I told myself it was healthy. After retirement, people look for pieces of themselves they think they misplaced. That's what I believed. Or maybe what I chose to believe. I poured the hot water into my teacup. And carried it to the dining room table. The house was quiet, too quiet for a Saturday evening. Our children were grown, living in different states, busy with their own families. For years I had defended Thomas whenever Evelyn hinted he seemed distant. "It's just a phase," I would say. "We've been married too long to start doubting each other now." But as I studied that photograph, I felt something colder than jealousy. It was clarity. The way his shoulders angled toward her. The way she looked up at him as if she had known him in some other version of his life. I zoomed in. There was no wedding ring on his finger. He must have taken it off. That detail hurt more than the touch. Evelyn called a few minutes later. I let it ring twice before answering. "I'm at home," I said calmly. I saw it. There was silence on the other end, the kind that carries more meaning than words. "Maggie," she began gently, "this isn't the first time." My hand tightened around the porcelain cup. "What do you mean?" She exhaled slowly. I didn't want to believe it at first. "But I've seen messages pop up when he left his phone at the house last month. I thought it was just friendly. Tonight, it's not friendly." I closed my eyes, not to block the image, but to let it settle. 45 years. A mortgage paid off. 2 children raised. Nights I stayed up while he finished graduate school. The year he was laid off and I worked double shifts at the library to keep the lights on. All of it stacked neatly like dishes in a cabinet I thought was secure. And yet, in a hotel courtyard under borrowed lights, he was standing as though he had already stepped into another life. "Don't do anything tonight," Evelyn said softly. "Let him come home." I looked around the dining room, at the framed anniversary photos lining the wall. I didn't feel rage. I felt something steadier. "I won't," I replied. He wanted a reunion. I think it's time we give him one he won't forget. Thomas did not call that night, which in itself was not unusual for a reunion weekend, but what felt different was that I no longer waited for the sound of the garage door. I washed my teacup carefully, dried it with the linen towel we received as a wedding gift in 1979, and placed it back in the cabinet with deliberate precision. The house felt the same, yet something invisible had shifted, as if the air pressure had changed before a storm. Evelyn arrived just after 9 o'clock. She did not bring flowers or sympathy. She brought her laptop. We sat at the dining room table where we had celebrated anniversaries and birthdays, and she opened the image again. "There are more," she said quietly, sliding her glasses up the bridge of her nose. She had always been the practical one between us. When our father passed away, she handled the paperwork while I handled the casseroles. Now she handled the truth while I handled my breathing. She showed me another photograph taken from a different angle. Thomas laughing. The woman touching his arm. Not a crowded moment. Not an accidental brush. A choice. I studied his face. It was not the face of a man trapped or confused. It was the face of someone comfortable. That detail mattered. "How long have you suspected something?" I asked. Evelyn hesitated only briefly. "Since March," she said. March. That was when he insisted on opening a separate checking account for travel expenses. That was when he began guarding his phone like a fragile secret. That was when he forgot our anniversary dinner reservation and claimed the restaurant had made an error. I remember how I defended him even then. I remember saying, "He is under stress. He deserves patience." I folded my hands on the table and nodded slowly. "All right," I said. "Show me everything." Evelyn pulled up a screenshot she had taken weeks earlier when Thomas left his phone charging in the kitchen during Sunday brunch. A message preview had appeared from a contact saved only as L. The words were simple. Counting down the days. At the time, Evelyn had told herself it could have been about the reunion. Now, paired with the photographs, it was no longer harmless. I felt something inside me settle, not break, not shatter, but settle into place like a verdict reached after careful deliberation. "I do not want a confrontation," I said calmly. "I want clarity." Evelyn studied me carefully. "What are you thinking?" she asked. I stood and walked to the hallway, glancing at the framed photographs that documented our life in orderly progression. Wedding portrait. First home. Our children on their first day of school. Family vacations to Florida. Each frame represented years of effort, compromise, forgiveness. I touched the edge of one and then let my hand fall back to my side. "He believes I do not see him," I said quietly. "That has been his advantage." I returned to the table and met my sister's eyes. "Let us remove that advantage." We began with the bank statements. Thomas handled most of our retirement investments, but my name was still attached to every joint account. Evelyn helped me log in. The numbers were not dramatic at first glance. Utility payments. Insurance drafts. Routine transactions. Then we noticed the pattern. Small withdrawals, $200 here, $300 there, spaced evenly over months. Always followed by a credit card payment linked to a hotel chain loyalty program. My pulse remained steady as I wrote the dates down on a yellow legal pad. April. May. June. July. The reunion was not the beginning. It was simply the most public chapter. "He thinks this weekend is freedom," I said softly. "He does not understand that it is evidence." Evelyn reached across the table and squeezed my hand. "You do not have to rush," she reminded me. "You have time." I looked around my home, at the furniture I chose, the curtains I hemmed myself, the mortgage I helped pay off dollar by dollar. "Yes," I replied. "And I intend to use it." Outside, a car passed slowly down our quiet suburban street. Inside, I closed the laptop gently. Thomas was 1,200 miles away under string lights and borrowed music. He believed he had stepped into a secret life. What he did not know was that, for the first time in months, I was no longer guessing. I was preparing. By midnight the house was silent except for the low hum of the refrigerator and the steady ticking of the clock in the hallway, and I realized that for the first time in months I was not waiting for Thomas to walk through the door. I was measuring the space he occupied in my life and considering how much of it had already become an illusion. Evelyn stayed the night in the guest room, and in the morning we sat at the kitchen table with fresh coffee and a stack of printed statements spread neatly between us. The early sunlight filtered through the blinds, drawing pale lines across the paperwork as if underlining what I had refused to see. I studied each transaction again, not searching for pain but for patterns. There were dinners charged in cities he claimed were only business stops, gifts purchased from boutiques I had never visited, and recurring payments to that same hotel chain. Nothing outrageous, nothing dramatic, just enough to build a quiet second life without drawing attention. That restraint told me this was not impulsive. It was planned. I remembered the spring afternoon when he suggested we downsize our retirement plans, saying we should be conservative with spending because the market was uncertain. I had agreed without question. I trusted his judgment. Now I wondered if caution had been for our future or for his. Evelyn closed her laptop gently and looked at me with the careful expression of someone bracing for tears. I did not give her any. Instead I asked her to drive me to the bank. The branch was only 5 miles from our house, a familiar building with beige walls and tidy landscaping. I had visited it dozens of times over the years, usually to deposit birthday checks for grandchildren or to sign documents Thomas placed in front of me with a reassuring smile. This time I requested a private meeting with the manager. I did not accuse. I did not dramatize. I simply asked for a full review of every joint account and a clarification of what required dual authorization. The manager, a woman in her early 40s with kind eyes, explained the policies patiently. I listened carefully, committing each detail to memory. By the time we left, I had transferred a portion of our savings into an individual account under my name alone, a legal move permitted under our state laws because the funds were marital assets. It was not an act of revenge. It was an act of awareness. Back home, I opened the safe in our bedroom closet where we kept important documents. Birth certificates. Property deeds. Insurance policies. I removed copies of everything and placed them in a folder that I kept beside me at the dining table. Each paper felt like a chapter of our shared history. 45 years condensed into signatures and numbers. I did not rush. I moved deliberately, as if restoring order after a storm that had not yet fully arrived. Around 3 in the afternoon Thomas sent a text message. Having a great time. You would love it here. I stared at the words for a long moment before responding. I am glad you are enjoying yourself. That was all. No accusation. No hint of knowledge. Evelyn watched me carefully. You are very calm, she said quietly. I folded the phone and placed it face down. Calm is not the same as unaware, I replied. The difference mattered. I walked through the house slowly that evening, touching the back of the sofa, adjusting a picture frame, straightening a stack of mail. This home was not just a structure. It was the result of decades of partnership, sacrifice, and shared intention. If Thomas believed he could divide that history neatly and step into something new without consequence, he underestimated the woman who helped build it. I stood by the living room window and looked out at our quiet street, at the maple trees lining the sidewalk and the neighbor walking his dog past our driveway. Everything appeared normal. And perhaps that was my greatest advantage. Because while he believed he was attending a reunion of the past, I was preparing for a reckoning of the present. Thomas returned home on Sunday evening just before dusk, his car pulling into the driveway as if nothing in the world had shifted. I watched from the living room window without moving, observing the familiar way he adjusted his jacket and checked his reflection in the side mirror before stepping out. He carried a small gift bag in one hand and his suitcase in the other, the picture of a husband returning from a pleasant weekend among old friends. When he opened the front door, he smiled easily. "You would not believe how many people asked about you," he said, setting the suitcase down beside the staircase. I nodded and accepted the gift bag. Inside was a souvenir coffee mug with the reunion logo printed in blue letters. Thoughtful. Ordinary. Almost convincing. "I am glad you had a good time," I replied evenly. He studied my face for a fraction of a second, perhaps expecting a different tone, but I offered nothing for him to measure. That night we ate dinner at the kitchen island as we often did, discussing travel stories and names from decades past. He spoke about classmates who had retired to Arizona and others who had grandchildren in college. He described laughter, music, and long conversations that stretched late into the night. I listened carefully, noting what he mentioned and what he avoided. He did not mention her. Not once. Later, as he unpacked upstairs, I stood in the hallway and watched him hang his blazer in the closet. He removed his watch and placed it on the dresser. He spoke casually about how good it felt to reconnect with people who remembered him before responsibility shaped his life. I considered that sentence quietly. Before responsibility shaped his life. I wondered if that was how he now viewed our marriage. A responsibility. A chapter he believed he had fulfilled. When he stepped into the shower, I sat on the edge of our bed and looked around the room. The framed photograph of our 40th anniversary sat on the nightstand beside his reading glasses. In that photograph we stood shoulder to shoulder, smiling into the camera, convinced that time had strengthened us. I traced the edge of the frame with my fingertip and felt no surge of anger, only recognition. For months I had sensed a distance but attributed it to aging, to routine, to the natural quiet that follows decades of familiarity. I had not considered that distance might be intentional. When he came out of the bathroom, towel draped around his neck, he looked refreshed. "I missed you," he said softly. The words hung in the air between us, neither heavy nor light. I met his eyes and answered calmly. "I am sure you did." There was a brief pause, subtle but noticeable. He looked away first. In bed that night he fell asleep quickly, his breathing steady beside me. I remained awake, staring at the ceiling fan turning slowly above us. I thought about the early years of our marriage when we could barely afford groceries and split 1 gallon of milk across a week. I thought about the nights I stayed up with sick children while he prepared for professional exams. I thought about how partnership is built not only on affection but on shared endurance. Those memories no longer felt fragile. They felt documented. Accounted for. In the morning he left early to run errands, mentioning that he needed to stop by the office even though he had retired 2 years earlier. I watched his car disappear down the street and then walked back inside with quiet certainty. He believed the weekend had ended and normal life had resumed. What he did not understand was that normal had already expired. I did not need to raise my voice or demand explanations. I needed information, patience, and timing. The reunion had not been a mistake or a lapse in judgment. It had been a glimpse into a version of himself he was willing to protect at the expense of everything we built. And I was no longer willing to be the only one protecting it. On Tuesday morning I made an appointment with an attorney whose office sat 12 miles from our home in a modest brick building near the county courthouse, and I did not tell Thomas where I was going. I dressed carefully in a pale gray blazer and low heels, the kind of outfit that communicates steadiness rather than drama. When I introduced myself to the receptionist, I used my full name, Margaret and Collins, as if re-establishing ownership over it. The attorney, a man in his late 50s with silver hair and measured speech, invited me into his office and closed the doors softly behind us. I did not begin with accusations. I began with facts. 45 years of marriage. 2 adult children. A jointly owned home valued at approximately $400,000. Retirement accounts, investment portfolios, life insurance policies. I laid out copies of bank statements and hotel charges across his desk like pieces of a quiet puzzle. He listened without interruption, occasionally making notes. When I finished, he folded his hands and asked, "What outcome are you seeking, Mrs. Collins?" I considered the question carefully. I was not seeking humiliation or spectacle. I was seeking stability. "I want to understand my position before I speak," I replied. He nodded. He explained state property laws, the implications of long-term marriage, and the importance of documentation. He advised that I continue gathering financial records discreetly and that I avoid confrontation until I was fully informed. His tone was calm, almost clinical, and that steadiness reassured me. By the time I left his office, I carried a folder containing preliminary guidance and a list of additional documents to secure. Outside, the late summer air felt warm against my skin, and I realized that preparation had a texture. It felt firm. Intentional. That afternoon I visited the insurance office and requested copies of our beneficiary designations. The clerk handed them to me without question. I scanned the pages slowly. Nothing had been changed yet. My name still appeared where it should. That detail did not comfort me. It simply told me that his plans were not complete. At home I placed the documents inside a lockbox I purchased with cash from my new individual account. The weight of the metal case felt reassuring in my hands. When Thomas returned from his errands that evening, he commented on how organized the house looked. "You have been busy," he said lightly. I smiled faintly. "I have been catching up." He kissed the top of my head and walked toward the kitchen, unaware that the balance of our marriage had shifted in ways he could not see. Over dinner he mentioned that a few classmates were planning a follow-up trip next spring and asked casually if I would mind if he joined them. I set my fork down gently and met his eyes. "We will see," I answered. The simplicity of the response seemed to unsettle him more than any argument might have. Later that night, as he scrolled through his phone beside me on the couch, I noticed the faint reflection of a message notification across his glasses. He turned the device away instinctively. I did not react. I had learned that silence can be more revealing than accusation. After he went to bed, I remained downstairs and opened my laptop. I began cataloging everything in a spreadsheet. Dates. Amounts. Locations. Each entry represented a decision he made without me. The act of recording them felt less like retaliation and more like restoration. I was reclaiming awareness, restoring balance to information that had been uneven for months. By the time I closed the computer, the clock read 11:30. The house was quiet again, but this time the silence did not feel hollow. It felt deliberate. Thomas believed he had returned from a reunion and resumed his familiar life. He did not understand that the true gathering had not yet occurred. I was assembling my own circle of clarity, document by document, signature by signature. And when the moment arrived, I would not be asking questions. I would be presenting conclusions. By Thursday the rhythm of our house had changed in ways that only I seemed to notice. Thomas moved through each room with the same familiar confidence, pouring his morning coffee, reading the newspaper at the kitchen island, commenting on the weather as if stability were guaranteed. I responded politely, measured in tone and expression, careful not to disrupt the illusion he believed was intact. But beneath the surface, every routine felt like a rehearsal for something else. That afternoon I met Evelyn again, this time at a small cafe 6 miles from our neighborhood where no one knew us by name. We chose a corner table away from the windows. I placed my folder on the table between us and opened it slowly. "I have spoken with an attorney," I said quietly. Evelyn nodded without surprise. She had expected this. I explained the options presented to me, the importance of documentation, and the advantage of preparation over confrontation. "He thinks I am unaware," I added calmly. "That assumption is my protection." Evelyn reached across the table and touched my wrist gently. "What is the next step?" she asked. I had considered that question carefully over the past 2 nights while lying awake beside Thomas's steady breathing. The answer was not impulsive. It was structured. I am going to invite a few friends over next weekend, I said. People who have known us for decades. People who respect him. Evelyn's eyebrows lifted slightly. A dinner? She asked. Yes, I replied. A celebration. 45 years of marriage deserves recognition. The words sounded almost sincere, and perhaps in a way they were. 45 years did deserve recognition. What changed was the context. I did not intend to create humiliation. I intended to create clarity. That evening I returned home before Thomas and began drafting a guest list. Old neighbors. 2 couples from church. A former colleague of his who had attended the reunion. I chose carefully, selecting individuals who understood the history of our marriage and the image Thomas valued. When he arrived home, I mentioned the idea casually over dinner. I was thinking we should host something small next Saturday, I said, cutting my chicken neatly. Just to celebrate how far we have come. He looked up, surprised but pleased. That sounds nice, he replied. What brought that on? I held his gaze steadily. Perspective, I answered. He smiled, apparently satisfied with that explanation. Over the next 2 days I finalized arrangements quietly. I ordered catered food from a local restaurant so I would not be distracted by cooking. I polished the silverware and selected the china we had received as a wedding gift. Each detail mattered. Presentation always had mattered to Thomas. On Friday afternoon I reviewed the folder one final time, organizing the bank statements, the hotel receipts, and printed copies of the photographs Evelyn had captured. I did not intend to wave them in the air or accuse him loudly. I intended to place them on the dining table with the same composure I used when setting plates. Evidence does not require volume when it is undeniable. That night Thomas mentioned again how meaningful the reunion had been. It reminded me who I used to be, he said thoughtfully. I listened, absorbing the admission beneath the sentence. And who was that? I asked gently. He paused. Someone with fewer responsibilities, he answered. I nodded slowly. Responsibilities have a way of shaping character, I said. Sometimes for better. He did not respond to that. He simply returned to his phone, unaware that the weekend ahead would not resemble the one he had just experienced. He believed he had already navigated the most delicate moment of his secret. What he did not understand was that the most deliberate moment had not yet arrived. And when it did, it would not be chaos. It would be controlled. It would be measured. And it would leave no room for misunderstanding. Saturday arrived with clear skies and a steady breeze that moved gently through the maple trees lining our street, and from the outside our home looked exactly as it had for decades, stable and welcoming. I woke before Thomas and moved quietly through the kitchen, arranging the catered trays and warming dishes and placing fresh flowers in a glass vase at the center of the dining table. The silverware gleamed under the overhead light. The china was set precisely, each plate aligned with deliberate care. Presentation had always mattered to him, and tonight would be no exception. When Thomas came downstairs, he paused in the doorway and looked around with visible approval. This looks beautiful, Maggie, he said, his tone softened by pride. You really went all out. I offered a faint smile. 45 years deserves attention, I replied evenly. He stepped closer and placed his hand briefly at my back, a gesture that once felt grounding but now registered as habitual. Guests began arriving shortly after 6 in the evening. The doorbell rang steadily as familiar faces stepped inside, carrying bottles of wine and small gifts wrapped in cheerful paper. Laughter filled the living room. Stories were exchanged about old vacations, church events, and the reunion that Thomas had so recently attended. He moved easily among them, recounting humorous anecdotes from Denver, describing classmates who had aged gracefully and others who had not. I watched him carefully from across the room, observing how comfortably he performed the role of devoted husband and respected friend. If anyone sensed the undercurrent beneath the surface, they did not show it. Evelyn arrived last, her expression calm and composed. She greeted Thomas warmly and embraced me with quiet understanding. The evening unfolded smoothly. Plates were filled. Glasses were raised. Compliments were offered about the food and the longevity of our marriage. At one point Thomas stood near the fireplace and raised his glass. "To Margaret," he said, smiling broadly. "For putting up with me all these years." The room laughed gently. I held his gaze as I lifted my own glass. "To Clarity," I answered softly. The word drifted across the room without drawing immediate attention, but I noticed Evelyn's slight nod from the corner of my eye. After dessert was served and coffee cups were placed in front of each guest, I stood from my seat at the head of the table. The conversation quieted gradually as eyes turned toward me. I did not rush. I did not tremble. I folded my hands lightly in front of me and spoke in the same steady tone I used when reading scripture at church. 45 years ago, I began, Thomas and I promised honesty, partnership, and shared responsibility. The room listened politely, assuming nostalgia. This past week, I continued, I received new information that reminded me how important those promises are. Thomas shifted slightly in his chair, his smile thinning at the edges. I reached beside me and placed a neatly organized folder on the table. I opened it calmly and removed the first photograph, setting it flat between the coffee cups. The image of the hotel patio and the string lights rested under the chandelier in our dining room. Silence spread outward. Slowly, like ink in water. I did not raise my voice. "I believe reunions are meant to celebrate the past," I said evenly. "But secrets belong in no celebration." Thomas stared at the photograph, then at me, his expression caught somewhere between disbelief and calculation. No one spoke. The evidence did not require embellishment. It lay there plainly, framed not by accusation but by fact. I met his eyes without anger. "I thought it was appropriate," I concluded softly, "to ensure that what was shared privately is now understood publicly." The air in the room felt still, heavy with recognition. I remained standing, steady and composed, aware that this moment was not chaos. It was completion. The silence did not break immediately, it settled first, thick and deliberate, as every pair of eyes moved from the photograph to Thomas and then back to me. He did not touch the image at first. He simply stared at it as though distance might blur its meaning. I reached into the folder again and placed a second page beside it, a printed hotel receipt with dates that aligned precisely with the reunion weekend. The soft clink of a coffee cup being set down echoed in the quiet room. I kept my voice level. "This is not about embarrassment," I said gently. "It is about truth." Thomas finally spoke, his tone strained but controlled. "Margaret, this is not what it looks like." I nodded slightly. "Then please explain what it is," I replied. I did not raise my voice. I did not rush him. I allowed the space to hold his answer. He glanced around the table, clearly aware that the same friends who had toasted our marriage were now witnesses to its fracture. "It was just conversation," he said after a pause. "Old memories. Nothing serious." I slid one more document forward, a list of hotel loyalty charges that extended back 6 months. "Conversations do not require repeated reservations," I answered evenly. I could see his posture change, the confidence from earlier in the evening dissolving into something more defensive. A few guests shifted uncomfortably, but no one interrupted. They were not here for spectacle. They were here for understanding. Evelyn remained seated quietly, her presence steady beside me. Thomas attempted another explanation, speaking about loneliness, about feeling invisible after retirement, about reconnecting with who he once was. I listened carefully. "You said earlier this week that the reunion reminded you who you used to be," I said softly. "I did not realize that version of you required secrecy." The words were not sharp, but they were precise. I allowed a moment of stillness before continuing. 45 years of partnership does not dissolve because of nostalgia. It dissolves because of choices. I watched recognition pass across his face, not sudden, but gradual, as though the reality of consequence was arriving in stages. I closed the folder gently and placed both hands on the table. I met with an attorney this week, I said calmly. A ripple of surprise moved through the room, but I did not deviate from my tone. I have reviewed our accounts, our assets, and our responsibilities. Thomas's eyes widened slightly. You did what? He asked, disbelief replacing earlier defensiveness. I informed myself, I answered. Because trust without awareness is not partnership. It is vulnerability. No one spoke. The house felt different now, not chaotic, but clarified. I continued, my voice steady and measured. I am not interested in shouting or humiliation. I am interested in resolution. Beginning tonight, financial accounts will require dual authorization. Certain assets have been secured. Documentation has been duplicated. His silence deepened as the weight of preparation became evident. I did not need to threaten. The facts were sufficient. I stepped back from the table and looked around at the faces that had witnessed our anniversaries, our holidays, our shared history. I invited you here because I did not want whispers, I said quietly. I wanted clarity. The chandelier above us cast steady light over the table, illuminating the photograph, the receipts, the years compressed into paper. Thomas finally lowered his gaze. Margaret, he began, but the sentence faded before it formed. I met his eyes one last time, not with anger, but with certainty. You wanted a reunion, I said softly. Consider this the closing ceremony. The room remained silent, but the silence no longer felt uncertain. It felt complete. The guests did not leave abruptly, they left quietly, one by one, offering brief embraces and measured words that carried more understanding than shock. The door closed gently behind the last of them, and the house returned to stillness, though it was not the same stillness as before. Thomas remained standing near the dining table, the photograph still resting beneath the chandelier light. He looked older in that moment, not because of age, but because illusion had drained from his posture. I gathered the documents carefully and returned them to the folder without haste. You did not have to do this in front of everyone, he said finally, his voice lower than I had heard it in years. I met his eyes steadily. I did, I replied. Because secrets grow in silence. He ran a hand across his forehead and sat down heavily in his chair. It was not supposed to go this far, he murmured. I considered the statement. It already had, I answered gently. There was no anger in my tone, only fact. I walked into the kitchen and began clearing plates, stacking them neatly by the sink. The act felt ordinary, almost grounding. Thomas followed a few minutes later, stopping at the doorway. What happens now? He asked quietly. I dried my hands on a towel and faced him fully. Now we move forward with clarity, I said. The attorney will contact you next week to discuss terms. Financial arrangements are already being reviewed. The house remains secure. There will be no sudden decisions. He stared at me as though seeing someone unfamiliar. You planned all of this, he said. It was not an accusation. It was recognition. I prepared, I corrected softly. There is a difference. He looked down at the kitchen floor, at the same tile we chose together 15 years earlier. I never meant to hurt you, he said after a long pause. I believe that in part. I also understood that intention does not erase impact. Harm does not require intention, I replied. It requires action. The word settled between us, not sharp, not dramatic, simply undeniable. He moved toward the hallway and stopped beside the staircase, glancing up at the second floor where our bedroom waited. Should I pack a bag? He asked quietly. I considered the question carefully, aware that this moment would shape the tone of everything that followed. "Yes," I said at last. "Take what you need for now. We will decide the rest with counsel." There was no shouting, no slammed doors, no spectacle. He nodded slowly and walked upstairs, the sound of his steps measured and subdued. I remained in the kitchen, listening not for noise, but for finality. When he returned 20 minutes later with a small suitcase, he paused near the front door. 45 years, he said softly. I never thought it would end like this. I stepped closer, but not so close that familiarity blurred the boundary. Neither did I answered. But endings do not arrive suddenly. They build quietly. He studied my face one last time, perhaps searching for the version of me that would soften, that would negotiate without structure. He did not find her. I opened the front door, and the evening air drifted inside, cool and steady. He stepped out onto the porch, suitcase in hand, and hesitated briefly before walking toward his car. I watched until the headlights disappeared down the street. Then I closed the door gently and leaned against it, not in collapse, but in stillness. The house felt different again, but not hollow. It felt honest. I walked back to the dining room and looked at the table where the photograph had rested. There was no debris, no chaos, only a clean surface reflecting the chandelier light. I sat down in my chair and folded my hands calmly. I had not lost a husband tonight. I had removed a secret. And in its place, I had reclaimed myself.